This video is about a topic that's very near and dear to me, because, well, I love these little guys. Handheld gaming has been my preferred method since I discovered the Game Gear as a small child. From that moment on, I was in love with the idea of being able to game anywhere. I didn't care that the games weren't the same quality as their console counterparts. I just loved the idea of playing a fun and unique experience while not being attached to a TV. The gaming experiences on handhelds at this point were not too dissimilar from what was on their 16-bit counterparts, just sort of in smaller bits. But this would change drastically when consoles entered in the 3D era. The Game Gear died, but the Game Boy line continued on. Games were still 2D, and honestly, I didn't care much about the discrepancy. I was more than happy to play the Game Boy's port of Perfect Dark. It must have beaten that game at least 5 times. Zelda Ages and Link's Awakening were also in my rotation, along with Super Mario Bros. Deluxe and various Pokemon games. Then there was Monster Rancher Explorer, Metal Gear Ghost Babel, Tomb Raider, and Wario Land. Most of these games had console equivalents, and I did play some of those, but their Game Boy counterparts stood on their own. I was happy with the experience they provided, and I'm still happy with the gameplay experience of many Game Boy games today. I just instead prefer to play them on a backlit GBA, since the OEM Game Boy Color screen kinda sucks. Speaking of, the creation of the GBA brought handhelds into the 16-bit era, and they were still really fun. I love the GBA Sonic games, the Game & Watch Gallery games, Castlevania, and even that weird Banjo and Kazooie thing. I really love the Super Mario RPG series, and my all-time favorite on the handheld, WarioWare. I could go on all day about how fun WarioWare was, but we'll save that for another time. While console games were coming into their own in the 3D space in the 6th generation, I feel handheld games were not too far behind. The games were still unique from their console counterparts, and instead of trying to create a one-to-one experience of their consoles, they leaned into their strengths, and even experimented a bit. Developers were able to get weird and creative. Because the games had a lower budget, it meant that there was less risk. I mean, seriously, you guys should go back and look at some of these demakes. They were insane. Shortly after, we got the DS and the PSP. Personally, this is the peak of true handheld gaming to me. These games were still distinctively different from their console counterparts, and were made truly for the portable experience. Sure, some wore console ports, but those were fewer and far between. The real shine was when those games took advantage of the hardware. I spent 1,000 hours in Tetris and Lumines. The Mario RPG series on the DS, both of the God of War games on the PSP blew my mind, and I can't forget about my all-time favorite, Rhythm Heaven. This game is so good. I mean, if you haven't played it before, go out, buy a DS, and then buy this game. Both consoles were also blown wide open by the modding community. I played the arcade version of Marvel vs. Capcom into the ground on my PSP. The first time I ever completed Sonic 3 was on my DS. I didn't even mention all the great games like Parasite Eve, Kenko Bancho, all the amazing Castlevania games, the Mega Man releases, The World Ends With You, Professor Layton, Loco Roco, Monster Hunter, God Eater, and my introduction to the Persona series. I could go on and on and on, but I think you get my point. This was truly the pinnacle of handheld gaming. Budgets hadn't yet grown to an unstable point, the games were still different from their console siblings, and we would get a steady release of great games. The power of these 7th generation handhelds fell somewhere between the N64, PS1, and the Dreamcast. The smaller screen made us all believe that these games looked better than they really were, but this was all part of the magic. After this progression, I was extremely excited to see what the 8th generation would bring. Now I get to gush a little bit about what I love, the PS Vita. It's honestly my favorite handheld of all time. However, it's only my favorite handheld because I'm able to play all of those great PSP classics on the device. That doesn't mean that I don't love the Vita's games, but at this point, the Vita was just a weaker version of the PS3. Early on, we received a lot of console ports, which were nice. The Vita became my primary way to play Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but gone was what made handhelds unique. Instead of looking for a unique handheld experience, I found myself comparing the game on my Vita to what existed on the more powerful siblings. Because, well, those games both existed in the same fashion on both platforms. Despite this, I still love the Sly Cooper collection, the Metal Gear collection, and Skullgirls. But none of these games were really built with the Vita in mind. It no longer felt special, and instead was competing with the consoles, and even its own sibling, the PS4. The 3DS did some of this as well. You can see this in the port of Hyrule Heroes and Xenoblade Chronicles, but it also featured its own slew of original games that were made specifically for the platform. Definitely more so than the handful that existed on the Vita. And I believe that's because the hardware was still severely underpowered. and it didn't have the same pressures that were pushed up against the Vita. More power means higher expectations, even when the hardware may be better suited for smaller, more original experiences. These higher expectations meant that the cost increased to develop these games. So publishers and developers were going to risk a lot less. Why spend $3 to $5 million to develop a unique handheld game for a niche audience, when you could just spend $5 to $8 million and develop a AA experience for the PS4, which has a much larger install base? I partially think this is why cross-buy was created by Sony, because they recognized that the budget to develop these games for the Vita would become so high that making games exclusively for the platform wouldn't be economically feasible for most developers. Even after the death of the 3DS, Nintendo followed up with the Switch and removed the option of a dedicated console from their portfolio. I partially think they did this because they recognized that handheld technology had increased so much, along with fan expectations, that the two can no longer coexist without cannibalizing your own flagship system. When the rumors of the PlayStation Portal were first announced, I had hoped that Sony was making a portable PS4, extending the life of the 8th generation while allowing developers to take advantage of the backwards compatibility of the PS5. I think a handheld that mirrors the previous generation, along with the current gen's console backward compatibility, is the only route with the current state of technology in order to not cannibalize your own flagship device. So this is a bit of a late addition to account for the new rumors that have been circulating. It appears that Sony may be working on a PS4 and possibly a PS5 compatible handheld. This essentially proves my previous theory. A true handheld with its own independent library can no longer exist on its own due to budget and gamer expectations. Sony may have recognized this as well and decided to take the hybrid route, similar to Nintendo, but still diverged just a bit. If Sony does go through with this plan, it comes with a few major advantages that the Switch never had. First is the possibility to create a cheaper product. The cost of technology decreases every year, and if this device is released in 2027 or 2028, the cost to produce this item should be less expensive. The second major difference is this device will have access to previous libraries. If compatible with both the PS4 and PS5, that would literally be 2 generations of backwards compatibility, and that would be before you even account for things like emulation. This would be huge for most gamers in the Sony ecosystem, since you likely already own games for both platforms, making large portions of your digital library accessible to you. That would be an amazing value. The third thing is developers already know the hardware of the machine. Major and minor studios have already built their workflows and game engines built for those generations of hardware, allowing them easily to continue development for the system if they felt inclined. Even if Sony does go through with this plan, I would argue that this new portable console wouldn't really be a true handheld. The games were designed to be played for longer periods of time, and are not broken up into shorter experiences like they were on traditional handhelds. This doesn't necessarily make for a bad experience, but it's definitely not the same experience I've grown up with. The old days of quirky demakes, experimental games, and attempting to translate games for the small screen are basically gone. I honestly don't believe they'll ever come back in any major way. The market for such games has shrunken dramatically over the years. Gamers now demand larger console-like experiences on their mobile devices. Fortnite can be played on phones after all. Steam Decks give you the power of a PC in the palm of your very large hands, and the Switch gets constantly ridiculed for not being powerful enough. The gaming mainstream no longer wants handhelds. They want portable console gaming on the go. This doesn't mean new traditional handhelds are completely dead. A few years ago, we saw the release of the Playdate, and I love that little thing. Sure, the screen isn't backlit, the crank is a bit gimmicky, but the hardware specs are what makes me think of the good old days. It's a device that technically can be replicated on modern hardware. But why would you want to? Heavy-duty consoles are meant for heavy-duty AAA games. The great part of limitations is that it breeds innovations. The coolest part of the Playdate for me is the uniqueness. Since it features a 1-bit screen and a crank, developers are likely to build a game for that platform first, even if they do plan on porting that game to different systems, making for a true traditional handheld experience. That's what it's really all about, playing to the strengths of the handheld, instead of trying to cram a console experience into one. Before I go off on a new topic, I'll end it there. So to summarize, what killed traditional handheld gaming, technological advances, ever-increasing budgets, and the gamer expectations that come with all of that. Well, that's it for now, everyone. Thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.